Hi, thank you for joining me for Bible study, the Prairie Oaks Pulpit Bible Study, here on my couch. Yeah, we're back at the couch. And so we wanted to look, and we've been looking at the events leading up to Jesus' passion, his crucifixion. And we've been spending most of our time in John, but we've been referencing Matthew and Mark and Luke because John writes as though he expects you to already know what Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote about, because he knew what they'd written about, because they'd already been written for a few decades before John got around to writing his. And so today we're not going to be in John's gospel. We're going to just stay in Luke's gospel, because again, Matthew and Mark, they tell some different things. Luke tells some different things. And then John is going to tell some different things as well. And it's not in contradiction to one another, but it is to complement or to complete one another. And so Luke chapter 23, and I'm going to start reading in verse 24, and I'm not going to finish until I get to verse, looks like I'm going to read through verse 47. So it's kind of a long reading, so if you'll bear with me, but I want us to get the real picture of what's going on here. So, Luke chapter 23, starting in verse 24. So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested, and he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. Now, as they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon, a Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. And a great multitude of the people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, Blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, and breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, Cover us. For if they do these things in the greenwood, what will be done in the dry? There were also two others, criminals, led with him to be put to death. And when they'd come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him, and the criminals, one on the right hand and the other on the left. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And they divided his garments and cast lots. And the people stood looking on, but even the rulers with them sneered, saying, He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ, the chosen of God. The soldiers also mocked him, coming and offering him sour wine, and saying, If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. An inscription was written over him in letters of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, This is the King of the Jews. Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, If you are the Christ, save yourself and us. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, Do you not even fear God, seeing you're under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, Assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Now it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. Then the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. So when the centurion saw what had happened, he glorified God, saying, Certainly this was a righteous man. This is the word of the Lord. Now, there's a lot of ground to cover here. And to help us, I'm going to just focus on primarily the three sayings of Jesus that are recorded here. One before he's actually on the cross, and then grouping two more together and then the last thing, because they reflect and they fit an outline of the words from the judge. They are words of judgment from the judge of all the earth. Because now that Jesus has been condemned, the gospel writers are reminding us that it doesn't mean he's powerless. He is the judge of the living and the dead. He is the one before whom every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. And so these three things remind us of who he is, and that this misjustice, this injustice, is something he submitted to, not something that he was a victim of entirely. Yes, they did with wicked hands, but he allowed it for you and for me. So let's pick up. So we see where Pilate, all right, this is what you want. This is what you will get. You will have your king crucified. And so he delivers him to the Roman soldiers, and they lead him from the judgment hall towards outside the city walls, because they didn't do executions within the city walls, not crucifixions at least. And so taken to a place, some of the gospel writers call it Golgotha. Luke gives it to us in a, not in the Aramaic, but Calvary. And you've probably heard of that place in some old gospel songs, right? And as they lead him through the streets of Jerusalem, the cross becomes too much for him to bear. And so a guy from what would be today Libya, that's where Cyrene was, a guy by the name of Simon, they forced him to help Jesus carry his cross. And Luke doesn't go into a lot of details on that. Mark will tell you more. John won't even mention it. But the focus goes from him to those standing around watching this take place. And there are these women, and they're mourning and weeping. And we're not told that it's the women who followed Jesus. So it may be just like professional mourners or just emotional people as they're weeping, because this execution is taking place. And Jesus says something here that's a little perplexing and even a little vexing. And as well, it's puzzling because it is a really long statement. And so one has to assume that there was a significant pause in the procession at this point for Jesus, who had been beaten and endured a tremendous amount of pain and suffering, and again, too weak to carry his own cross anyways, to have the time to gasp out these words. And so it's a significant statement here, but this is the daughters of Jerusalem statement, in which he tells them, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves. And so two things I want to bring out in this, and that is, daughters of Jerusalem is one of those phrases that has a line attached to it. And if you follow it all the way back to the other end, you end in the Old Testament prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. It's words of judgment, where God, through his prophets, warned, quote, the daughters of Zion, the daughters of Jerusalem, that judgment was coming. The wrath would come for their condemnation. And so that's the context as Jesus says, you're wasting your tears for me. You should be weeping for yourselves. Because Jesus once again is reminding his listeners, for those who reject their Messiah, judgment is coming. Condemnation is coming, to be more precise with our English words. Condemnation. And if you read Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, and other places in the Gospels, Jesus spoke often words of warning that Jerusalem needed to know the consequences of rejecting their Messiah. That the wrath of God would be poured out on them in such a horrific way within one generation of his death, that it would be a foretelling of the end of time. It would be that catastrophic. It would be like the Great Tribulation that we, in our context, know is coming because Jesus spoke of it. And that's the context of that in verses 29 through 30, is that people will be crying out for mercy, but there will be none. And history records for us that the Roman legions, frustrated with yet another rebellion by the Jewish people, by their authorities, surround Jerusalem, starve them out, and gradually destroy the city with the people in it. And eventually, everything is destroyed, burned, overturned, and obliterated, including the temple of the Lord. Such massive destruction, foretold by Jesus. And it's interwoven, if you were to go back to Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, and other places, you'll see that it's interwoven with his end of the age descriptions as well. And that tells us a couple different things. This is a side note. One is that when Jesus saw the judgment, he saw it and foretold it just as the prophets of old had, where the distance between events is a little blurred. Just looking at the peaks like in the mountain range, you don't always know how far apart they are. And so Jesus continues that perspective in his foretelling of these things. And also that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they were not written after AD 70, but before, because they didn't do anything to clarify his words, to point out how these things had already been fulfilled. John, he skips over those things because it's now very obvious what those words meant. There was both a past tense for him, written after AD 70, and yet future tense, as described in his letter of the revelation of Jesus Christ to the Apostle John. And so just a little side note there for you. When people question, well, can you really trust the scriptures? Weren't they written hundreds of years after the fact? Apparently not. They were written pretty soon after the fact, less than a generation after, by the eyewitnesses and those who, like Luke, spoke to the eyewitnesses and compiled a historical record. And so this is snapshot, words from the judge, warning of condemnation. So is there any hope to those who have rejected their Messiah and who have condemned the righteous one? Jesus' second words, second and third in our reading of the judge, they give us some hope. And that's where we see, so Jesus, as he is led with two criminals, and they begin to nail him to the cross, we hear Jesus say, verse 34, then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And so he intercedes to the Father for them. That is our Jesus. He is our intercessor. And so he speaks words of mercy and offered forgiveness, interceding for them. Now, in this one here, Father, forgive them, for they know not. Well, what kind of forgiveness is he speaking of? And I guess I would make a distinction here in which there is a forgiveness, the temporary respite from the deserved condemnation that they have coming to them. But then there is also the offer of eternal forgiveness, isn't there? So on the one hand, don't give them the full wrath they deserve, but wait. Because in it is the second layer. There is the offer of eternal forgiveness if they'll receive it, if they'll just come and do it. But to whom is this offered? For they know not what they do. Well, in this case, the Jewish authorities, they murdered Jesus with their eyes wide open. They knew they were murdering an innocent man of God. But did they really know that he was the Son of God, as he claimed and as they rejected him? The Apostle Paul, he argues in 1 Corinthians 2:8. If you want to flip over there real quick with me, you can, or I'll just read it to you. 1 Corinthians 2:8, the Apostle Paul says, "None of the rulers of this age knew. For had they known, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory." But speaking of the gospel as a mystery, they didn't realize the full importance of what they were doing. Because if they had, they wouldn't have partaken in it. But even more so, the crowds, they were the blind led by the blind. They knew less than even the Jewish authorities did. And then you look at the Romans, the ones actually there as Jesus says this, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they do." They knew even less. They just were doing what they were told by a Pilate who knew more than they did. But as we talked last week, he was a pagan who did not understand, who did not know. But to his discredit, and to each of those in this chain of a responsibility, they did not know, nor did they care to know. And so they're culpable, but they are, I don't know how to say it, but there's a level of exoneration in that they didn't understand, they didn't know how guilty they truly were. And one thing that Jesus made clear in his teachings and other places even, that there's a greater condemnation to those who sin knowingly than to those who sin in ignorance. And so one answer to this prayer we see is where we finished reading. Did you notice that verse 47? I think all of them mention him, that there was a centurion who saw what had happened. He'd watched the whole crucifixion, that this man died differently than everybody else. And he sees it and glorifies God, saying, certainly this was a righteous man. Certainly, as John records him saying, this man is the Son of God. He knew this man was different and knew, this is an innocent man. One more exclamation of how this is the sinless Lamb of God who laid down his life for the sins of the world. And so, where are we in this? Are we going to reject, or will we accept the offered gift of eternal forgiveness, to be made right with God? Because by reading this, I suspect we'll see that centurion. He knew. Maybe not. Maybe he just said, but he didn't know. But he was convicted and knew this man is the righteous one. We're going to look some more at those that are forgiven So don't worry, we're not finished yet, but we're going to pick up next week and we'll see more of what God's word has for us in words from the judge. God bless, God keep you. Thank you for joining me.